I'm a 20-year-old male, and I run a large haunted house attraction. You pay to walk through, and we scare the lights out of you. We hold casting sessions about 3 weeks before the haunting season starts, and we always have interesting people show up. I develop a close connection with some of the actors throughout the season. A lot of haunters will tell you that this will develop a bond between people in some weird way. There was one kid that stood out to me during last year's audition. In fact, he impressed me so much that I allowed him to pick what scene he wanted to work. We never do that. We usually select the scenes that we want the actors to work. He ended up going with the butcher shop, and his performance was perfect. He scared the daylights out of the test group. We talked for about 3 hours after the test runs, and I'll never forget what he told me before leaving the makeup room. I'm just glad I found a job that allows me to act like I want to every day, minus the murder charges. We laughed about it, and I told him that I would be calling him soon. About 4 days later, I got his application out of the stack, and I was excited to call him and officially hire him. However, an old man answered the phone when I called. He went quiet when I asked him if the guy was home. After a short while, the old man asked me what I wanted with him. After I explained, the old man told me that the guy was no longer available. And naturally, I was very disappointed, because I knew this guy would have been great for the haunted house. Fast forward to December. I was randomly browsing the internet when I came across a news article on Yahoo's front page. It said, "Chilling 911 call finally released." There was a picture of someone who looked like the guy who had auditioned that year. After reading the article, I confirmed that it was the same guy. He had been arrested for shooting his mother and sister in the head. And I felt something that I had never felt before. I can't even explain it. Before clicking on the 911 call, I was expecting it to be a frantic neighbor, or maybe a family member. But no, it was him. He calmly spent 24 minutes explaining to the operator what he had done. Completely emotionless. Saying things like, "I guess I'm pretty evil, whatever." Listening to the call sent a chill up my spine. All I can say is you have to hear it for yourself. What if he had ended up working at my haunted house? Would he still have done it? Would he have killed somebody at the attraction? I think about this a lot more than I should, and I can't stand that.
Okay, is there any reason that you were so angry at your mother and your sister?
I don't know, I wasn't, it's weird, I wasn't even really angry with them. It just kind of happened. I've been kind of planning on killing for a while now.
The two of them, or just anybody?
My family lives sort of on the outskirts of Bradford. Of course, much like the town itself, our house was also surrounded by forest. If you took in the scene from our back porch, you would see nothing but sprawling trees for miles. I tell you this so you can gain a sense of isolation. Out at my house, you could scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would come to help you. This happened back in the summer of 1996. I was 11 years old at the time. I had a childhood friend named Marty, who was the same age. Our fathers worked together and knew each other well. He would come over almost every Friday to hang out. Marty and I found ourselves hiking through the trees as we often did. However, we were feeling a bit daring and went further into the forest than we usually did. There was this barrier of trees that we would never go past, simply because I didn't know the area beyond that point. We continued past the barrier into uncharted territory. We eventually came upon a clearing. In the middle of this clearing was an old, disheveled-looking tent. Being the curious young men we were, we of course had to see inside. As we approached, I could feel the temperature around me drop. I'm no stranger to the cold, but this was in the middle of summer. Even at my age, I could sense that there was something truly sinister inside this tent. A part of me was screaming to hightail it out of there, but my own curiosity pushed me forward. We both stopped just outside the tent, and suddenly, we were both too frightened to move any further. We were both frozen in place, staring at the open flap of the tent as it swayed from side to side. The sky seemed to grow even darker since we discovered this tent, and though we were standing directly in front of it, we could not see inside. What happened next is the reason that I still struggle with alcoholism. A dark hand slowly emerged from the tent's opening. It reached out to us, with long black nails protruding out from its fingertips. I'm not ashamed to admit that I pissed myself out of fear. The hand slowly turned and made a beckoning gesture with its index finger, and that's when Marty and I heard a deep, bellowing laughter from inside the tent. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I just remember me and Marty running for our lives, tearing through the woods and back to my house. I do have a vague memory of me briefly looking behind me as I ran to see a tall, dark, and human figure standing just outside the tent. Upon returning, Marty immediately called his mom to come pick him up. My mother asked us what was wrong, and we both explained to her that we saw some kind of creature in the forest. My mother ultimately dismissed our claims, but led us in a prayer while we waited for Marty's mom to arrive. Marty never came back after that, and we sort of drifted apart. Sadly, Marty began hanging out with the wrong crowd and began doing hardcore drugs when he was around 14. He ended up hanging himself in his bedroom when he was 17. As for myself, I suffered from severe night terrors that tormented me for years after that day in the woods. I'm not going to get into what I experienced in my nightmares, but I will say that I became an alcoholic as a result. After moving far away and attending numerous AA meetings, I'm glad to say that I've turned my life around, and I even have a family of my own. When I was in elementary school, one of the boys a few grades ahead of me was Kyle Doobie. I was 2 or 3 grades below him, so I didn't have much interaction with him outside of recess. He often made it a point to stand right behind me and yank on my pigtails as hard as he could, under the pretense that I was a horse and he was riding me. He also used to bring knives to school and would sometimes threaten some of his classmates with them when they did something to make him angry. And at one point he actually pulled a knife on a young girl. It was after school behind one of the buildings. Why nothing was officially ever done about it, I couldn't tell you. But my school, being very small, was not known for being on top of the disciplinary side of things. There was just something about Kyle, the hair pulling, and just the general way he acted, that ultimately made me feel uncomfortable whenever he was around. I wasn't alone in this regard. Former classmates have also expressed feeling uneasy in his presence. To my relief, he ended up moving away, and none of us heard anything about him for a number of years. Until one day he showed up on the local news, having been arrested for the murder of Nicole Cable. He had made a fake Facebook profile, lured her out of her house, kidnapped her, and left her in the back of his dad's pickup truck. His intention was to pretend to find her, so that he would be labeled a hero. When he found out that she was dead, he dumped her body in the woods and covered it with sticks and leaves. They found her about a week later. I was in school when I found out, and I had to go to the nurse's office because I felt so sick. It's very disconcerting to know that a murderer used to yank on my hair. As of writing this, he is going on trial in the next couple of days, which is what prompted me to share this experience. I'm a female, and this happened during spring break of 2011. At the time, I lived in New Jersey, and I would often drive out to the pine barrens on Saturdays and jog along a trail that a friend of mine showed me. I don't mean to be vague, but for the life of me I can't remember the name of this trail, but I do remember that it was located in South Jersey, and from what I understand there's lots of trails that run through that area. During this time, I was going through some health problems, and I was really focused on losing weight. During my jogs, I would often listen to my headphones. I had a playlist on my iPod that would help me get motivated. After parking my car, I set off on foot. I usually saw one or two other backpackers or joggers traversing the trail, but today, there was no one. About 30 minutes after I started, I got this feeling that I was being watched. I tried my best to brush it off as I continued down the path. This feeling became more and more prevalent. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on me. It got to the point where I stopped jogging and took out my headphones and listened carefully. I heard several frantic footsteps coming from behind the surrounding trees. At this point, I was becoming a bit unnerved, but I figured that it could be some kids just messing around. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. I should mention that on this particular trail, about a half a mile from its starting point, your cell phone was all but useless. After a minute or two of just standing there, I decided that it was time to cut this jog short. As soon as I turned around, I heard a rustling sound from behind me. I turned, and what I saw utterly horrified me. A masked man wearing a pair of boxers emerged from a bush that was alongside the trail. I know that may sound comical to some of you, but I assure you it was not. The mask this person was wearing is kind of hard to describe. It looked like an animal head of some kind, and just sort of hung off this guy's head, like it was several sizes too big for him. The most disturbing part of all was this half-naked maniac was covered in what looked like blood. It was like I was involuntarily thrusted into the plot of a horror movie. I took off running down the trail. As I did, I heard laughter and shouting coming from several directions behind me. I thankfully found my way back to the car in one piece. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. I pulled over at the nearest gas station and immediately called the police. It took them almost an hour and a half to get out there, and he informed me that he would call in more cops and comb the area. He told me that someone from his department would eventually follow up with me. The next morning, I got a phone call from the police. They, of course, didn't find anyone matching the description I gave. However, they did find the skinned carcass of a deer not far from where I had encountered the man. I don't have confirmation on this, but thinking back to how strange that mask looked, I have to ask a question. Was that man wearing fresh deer skin?
Morrow Road is perhaps one of the most chilling routes you can drive in all of North America. Near Detroit, just across Lake St. Clair, you'll find Clay Township, a small, rural community. Running through it is Morrow Road, a two-lane strip of paved road lined on both sides by thick woodland. On the surface, it's pretty unassuming, just another dusty trail in the good old US of A, but appearances can be deceiving. It's actually home to a rather chilling urban legend. As the story goes, in 1893, a woman went out in the middle of the night during a snowstorm. Her reason? She was frantically looking for her young son, who had gotten out of the house somehow. The storm was severe that night, and while searching for her child, the woman sadly froze. Neither her nor her son were ever found. Rumour has it that the woman still hangs around Morrow Road though, only in a much more ethereal sense. If you live near the area, here's something you can try for yourself. Legend says that if you drive out to Morrow Road at midnight and park on the old bridge, you can perform a very simple ritual to summon the frozen lady. Simply honk your horn 3 times. Many people say that if you do, the woman will appear to see if you have her son. According to people who claim to have seen her, she'll be wearing a white gown stained red with claret, and her eyes will be missing. If you try to flee, either on foot or in your vehicle, she'll chase after you. If she catches you, it's game over. In the words of one local resident, I was skeptical of this whole legend, so I got together with some friends and we drove out there one night in 1992. We shut off the car and sat there for a minute. My friend honked the horn a few times, and right away, we heard a baby crying. It was coming from underneath the bridge. We got out of the car, and I leaned over the guardrail. I could hear it crying, but I couldn't see anything. Somewhere, out of the darkness, we heard a woman shout, "Where's my baby?"
Virgin ghosts are said to be found in older, abandoned buildings and in isolated parts of the forest. They have long, dark hair covering their faces, dressed in all-white gowns with no shoes and just a pair of perfectly white, clean socks. The virgin ghosts have also been called Chonogwishin. When encountering one of these entities, it's been said that there will be a drastic change in temperature in the room, giving the potential victim fair warning to leave the area immediately. One urban legend tells of a man who was searching through a building when, suddenly, the room became freezing cold. The man kept on his pursuit until he heard a voice. Not just any voice, but the voice of a virgin ghost. The being then instructed him to close his eyes and count to 100. The man did as he was told until he reached the number 49, when the urge to open his eyes overcame him, and he looked directly at the ghost. That was the last thing the man would ever see. Here is a bit of backstory on where this urban legend came from. Though there are some debates on the true origins, most point to old Korean culture as the culprit of this story. See, back in those days, for a woman to die as a virgin meant she died without a partner and did not produce any offspring. So parents came up with a way to ensure their children would grow up and have families by creating this elaborate legend. Children grew up hearing that if they did not lose their virginity by the time they died, they may too become a virgin ghost, forever haunting the living. It's very peculiar when you think about it. In our society, it isn't typical for parents to encourage their daughters to lose their virginity.
This past August, I picked up a lot of side jobs house sitting, while working at a ranch that gave horseback riding lessons. The families were all very nice and it paid well. This past November, I was house sitting for a family and watching their Labrador retriever named Maggie while they were on vacation. They lived in a very nice neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The house was on the far end of the neighborhood, and thick trees flanked the backyard, and a dirt road ran behind the trees. I accidentally went down the road the first time, and tried to find the house, but there wasn't much down there. Just an abandoned house with lots of deer in the front yard, and a small run-down ranch house. The first night, everything was great, but the second night, not so much. I had this weird feeling a few hours before I went to bed, but I wrote it off as spending too much time reading creepy stories on Reddit. I made sure all the doors were locked, blinds were closed, and I went to bed just after midnight. But as I fell asleep, I still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Maggie usually sleeps with me, but that night she just followed me up the stairs and to the bedroom, and then just sulked back downstairs. At 2:26 a.m., Maggie woke me up by standing next to the bed and whining. I had just let her out before I went to bed, and I was pretty sure she didn't have to go to the bathroom. I rolled over and hoped that she would stop, but she didn't. I gave in soon enough, and as I climbed out of bed, I realized that the house was freezing cold. I followed Maggie downstairs to the kitchen. All the doors to the house were weird. You can't open any of them from the inside or outside without a key. Not to mention this was a very heavy door, not the kind that just gets blown open by the wind. The only thing that eased my mind was that Maggie didn't seem ready to kill an intruder, and she'll usually at least bark at you. So I did a quick look around. I was too scared to do anything more. Nothing seemed out of place. The owners often left credit and debit cards, as well as wads of cash lying on the counters, and it was all there. If anyone was going to steal something, it was right next to the door, and easy pickings. But since nothing was missing, I tried to brush it off as just forgetting to lock the door. I made sure it was locked this time and went back to bed. Maggie still didn't want to sleep with me, and went back downstairs. Less than an hour later, she woke me up again. This time, I didn't question her. I crept back downstairs more cautiously than I had before. The back door was open again. This time the key that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was in the lock. Someone had been in the house with me. The police were called. They looked all around the house but found no one. Everything of value was still in place, so I was really worried about the intentions of whoever broke in. The family was shocked that something like that happened and have since moved to a large farm 20 minutes away and now have video surveillance. I'm part of an all-female roller derby league. I would wake up at 6, skate around the local basketball court for about 40 minutes, hit the gym, then meet my team around 8. To be a champion at the sport, you have to be more than just fast. You have to be made of stone, and you have to be prepared to knock somebody down at a moment's notice. I've been with the Flying Banshees for about 3 years now. We were at a match against our most hated opponents. It was at this incredibly old and run-down roller rink. As we were tearing around the court, the lights would often flicker on and off like strobe lights. Add the occasional trickle of water from the leaky roof above, and it was by far the most dangerous course we had ever skated on. We really should have called off the match before it even started, but we hadn't driven 3 hours just to quit. Normally, before we start skating, there's a coordinator who checks us over to make sure that we're not carrying anything dangerous or illegal on our person. It's no joke. I recall one time someone had hid a razor blade in their elbow pads. Apparently that day, no one checked the other team, because halfway through the match, as I'm flying around the rink, trying to put some points on the board, I accidentally flew right into a girl on the opposing team, and she hit the ground hard. I didn't hear the whistle, so I kept right on going. You don't get into a sport like this without having to eat some floor sometimes. I've been flattened a few times now, but I always get right up and get right back into the game. As I was coming back around the track, I noticed she was standing back up and leaning against the barrier wall, staring at me with pure hatred. Right before I was just about to pass her, I saw her pull something from under her shirt. I raised both hands instinctively. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, I saw a pocket knife shoved through the palm of my hand. I slowed to a stop, just staring at it in disbelief. Then the pain hit me like a punch to the gut, and I went down. To make a long story short, I was rushed to the emergency room, and the girl was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Turns out it wasn't her first offense. My hand was bandaged up, and I was the first one at our next practice. With the brace on my arm, my teammates took to calling me Claw, so at least I got a pretty cool nickname out of it. One thing that still bothers me though, and sometimes I can't help but dwell on it, but if the lights hadn't flickered when they did, would she have planted that knife somewhere far worse than my hand? Apologies for any grammar mistakes. English is not my first language. Back in the early 2000s, I was working as a truck driver in Mexico City. I don't recall what I was transporting that evening, but it was late at night, and my mind was unfocused, and I was cruising a residential street, looking for a place to pull over so I could use the bathroom. As I cruised slowly through an intersection without braking, I noticed an individual jaywalking across the street from the glow of my headlights. I pressed down my brakes and honked, shouting in anger out the window at the person. I couldn't tell if the figure was a man or a woman at first, but when they turned around to yell back at me, I was pretty certain that it was a man in woman's clothing. He barked at me for several minutes in a deep, heavy voice, and continued off down the sidewalk. In addition to the woman's clothing, I noticed the man was carrying a purse over one shoulder and a bulging plastic bag in his opposite hand. I shrugged and assumed that he was a male prostitute or something of the sort, and continued up the road and forgot all about him a few minutes later. The whole incident lasted perhaps 15 seconds. The next day I heard through my wife's brother that an old woman named Ana Maria Alfaro had been murdered in her home the night before, on the exact same block I had encountered the man in woman's clothing. I called the hotline and spoke to a female detective about my exchange with the stranger on the road, and she seemed very interested, and asked me several additional questions about the person that I hadn't even had time to notice or consider. She then asked me if I would come in and sit down with a sketch artist, but I responded that I barely got a good look at the person's face, and mostly was just able to describe the person's build and voice. I never heard back from the detective, but what followed for several more years was a reign of murder and terror, where several elderly women were murdered in their homes. I remembered I was at my son's birthday party in January of 2006 when I heard the news that the old lady killer had been arrested, and while the person I had seen had very likely been the killer, he wasn't a male prostitute. In fact, it wasn't even a he. Juana Barraza was a 50-year-old woman and a professional Mexican wrestler, best known for her bright pink outfit with a butterfly mask. She was detained by police fleeing the scene of her latest murder after neighbors had reported sounds of a struggle. Motivated by the resentment of her mother, who let strange men sexually abuse her as a girl, Barraza murdered more than 11 elderly women in their own homes, often strangling them with phone cords or stethoscopes. After killing them, she would rob their houses and simply walk out the front door and into the night. Barraza had a very masculine face, and due to the testimony of several eyewitnesses, including my own, the police were convinced they were looking for a man dressed as a woman, likely a transvestite, and many long months were wasted questioning the transvestite community. Barraza selected the women based on age, location, and how often they were alone. Using a social worker's identification card, she would trick the women into letting her in by saying that she was from the government and informing them they were eligible for welfare programs. In March of 2008, she was sentenced to a whopping 759 years in prison. I often wonder if I would have been doing the world a favor if I had hit her with my truck that night. I hate the fact that I even have a story to share, but it goes to show you when living in a major metropolitan city, you never know what walks of life you'll pass by or drop off. So a little backstory. In 2003, I was a 16-year-old employee at an urban clothing store here on the south side of Chicago. At the time, I had a manager who was in his early 20s by the name of Anthony. Anthony was pretty arrogant and obnoxious, but overall he was a really cool guy. I used to kind of give him shit and tease him whenever it came to approaching the ladies, because he always seemed timid or too aggressive. I was, and still am, a ladies' man, so yeah, I was being an asshole. After working at this place for about 3 months, Anthony asked me if I would drop him off at home. It wasn't far from the direction I was heading in, so I dropped him off maybe twice a week for the next month or so. Now let me tell you, these car rides were quite uncomfortable. This guy, as much as we spoke at work, would not speak and sorta just kept looking straight, barely ever blinking. It got to the point where his awkwardness went from being entertaining to straight up creepy. Fast forward 3 or 4 years later, I'm watching the news as they go into detail of a horrific crime committed by a Comcast installation worker. Apparently, the worker entered 2 homes for an installation. He sexually assaulted, beat, and strangled 2 women. The real unfortunate thing is that this happened on 2 different occasions, and after the first murder, the gentleman was arrested and questioned, but ended up being released and sent back out to work, which allowed him to strike again. As the picture of his mugshot flashed on the screen, I froze. It was Anthony. Now, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I've grown up and befriended a fair share of people who ended up becoming murderers, but this takes the cake.
I live in the southern part of California, Orange County to be specific. My dad grew up here before moving in with my mother on the East Coast, and then eventually back to the OC. When he was a young teenager, most of our neighborhood was full of orange groves. He and his friends used to explore in there and smoke weed in them. My dad told me he once had a friend whose name I can't remember, so for the sake of this story, we'll call him Jack. He was the son of a woman named Frances Marie Klug, a religious cult leader who thought she'd been visited by God or Jesus or something. She claimed to be a prophet, and eventually broke away from the Catholic Church to form the Hill of Hope congregation. This woman had a lot of followers. Her son was definitely not one of them, as he would often hang out with my dad in the groves, smoking weed and talking shit about his mother and her followers. Frances, according to my dad, always had these bodyguard type dudes around her, who oftentimes were armed. This made her far scarier than any elderly crazy woman should be. They'd go looking for Jack, forcing him sometimes to hide in the groves. The Hill of Hope eventually created a fort of some kind in Carbon Canyon, fitting because a bunch of creepy as fuck things go on there all the time. At this time, the fort, or compound, was in the process of being built. Jack and his mother had been bumping heads more often, and my dad started to notice that Jack wasn't around as often either. Eventually, he stopped making appearances altogether. Frances Klug eventually up and left with a lover of hers to another country. Some sources say that she returned and eventually died at the hill in '09. But the Hill of Hope is still there in Carbon Canyon, still guarded and still in use, I believe. They're very secretive, and they don't let any outsiders onto the property. My dad swears that Klug had her followers kill her son and hide his body under the cement foundations of the hill. The kid disappeared without a trace. Klug didn't seem fazed, and the cement was laid down shortly afterwards. My dad says it's too much of a coincidence. He never did hear from his friend again. The original poster has included information, an article, and a link to the website of the Hill of Hope. This can all be found in the description below.
This encounter took place when I was 13. I live in a very quiet village in Scotland, and this town has never had a kidnapping problem before that I know of, so I wasn't exactly prepared for this encounter. My parents asked me to run to the store for some essentials like milk and bread, etc. So I start walking the half-mile or so down to town. Since I am a really paranoid person, I normally keep a good eye out on my surroundings, and I notice something is off. A black minivan is driving slowly behind me. I'm too afraid to turn around to see the driver, but I pick up my walking pace. When I do, they start driving a little faster. In my head, I'm screaming, "I'm gonna die! I'm gonna die!" I finally make it to the store parking lot and practically sprint for the front doors. I probably looked like an idiot, but when you think you're going to die, you run pretty fast. I talked to one of the cashiers, who was a very nice young lady who looked to be in her early 20s. I told her I thought I was being followed and pointed to the vehicle so she could get a good look at the plate number. She said that the staff would look out for me. That made me feel a little bit better, and I made my way to the dairy aisle. I was scanning for the cheapest milk when there was a tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see a 6'2", middle-aged man that had greasy black hair and was wearing a tracksuit. "Hey there, I just wanted to say that you're really beautiful. Very pretty." He took a few steps towards me. I, being a person who really hates human interaction, started to cry silently. The tears were just spilling down my face with no sound. He takes this opportunity to say, "Now, stop crying. I don't want that gorgeous face of yours all wet. You and me should go down and have a drink together. What do you say?" I was so scared at this point, but that's when I heard the cashier's voice coming from behind him, asking him what the hell he was doing. "Oh, well, I'm just asking my beautiful girlfriend if she wants to have a drink at the bar, that's all." I look up to the lady and say, "I'm 13. This is where she threatens to call the police. He backs off and says that this has all been a big misunderstanding and he thought I was older. He then turns and runs out of the store. The lady, whose name was Rachel, helped me gather the rest of my items since I was in a panicked state. She then called the police and told them the guy's license plate number and called my parents to inform them that they should come pick me up. I gave her my mom's number. I brought her a box of chocolates the next day to say thank you. I don't know what happened to the man, but I hope he's in police custody, where he belongs. I moved to my dad's when I was 10, and I didn't know anyone in the area except for the family my dad was friends with. A single mom with 3 kids. Luckily, there was a girl a couple of years older than me. I was 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over the years. We weren't close, but ended up having the same friends. One night, my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone because my friend's mom was at work. Here's where things get terrifying. Her mom had been helping out this one lady through her work, and she got to know her fairly well. She found out that she had a sister who was in a mental asylum, but had been let out recently. The night Rob was hanging out with my friend, they get a knock on the door. My friend thought it was their mom. She knocks a certain way when coming in, and answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there, and took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. It wasn't her mom, it was the sister of the lady her mom was helping, and she figured out through talking to her sister where the family lived and her mom's working schedule. She came in, and this is where I don't know all the details, and I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbors to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week from Christmas, decapitated her, and left her body naked in a bathtub. But I don't know for sure. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a very well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. I got dragged along with his wife to church every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not. The one saving grace of going to church with my dad's wife was the opportunity to go on the playground after Sunday school class and the standing offer of cake, which they had almost every Sunday. It was one Sunday in late November. I was dragged to church with my dad's wife. Afterwards, as usual, me and the rest of the kids from class poured into the churchyard to socialize and drop cake everywhere. Now, I don't really remember what prompted me to approach a girl named Abby. She was 2 years younger than me, and a lot more popular. She was somebody that I barely knew, and hardly ever spoke to. But still, something within me told me that I had to tell her something important. So I sought her out on the playground that morning. "Hey, Abby," I started, feeling driven by something I couldn't explain. "You have to grow your fingernails out, so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was dead serious as I said this. She gave me a slightly confused look and said, "Okay, why?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I just kind of shrugged and told her, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, she, her younger brother, and their mom would be found dead, murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother William. He managed to hide from the police for at least 2 days, eventually being captured a half-hour away in the town of Ayer. When he was arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out that she and her family had been brutally murdered. I finally understood why I had to warn her, but still could not explain how I knew. Regardless, I view it as a failure on my part. I remember being incredibly distraught about it. No 9-year-old should have that kind of burden or guilt. I feel awful about what happened to Abby and her family, and I wish I could have done more to save her life. It took me years to mentally accept what happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, but I was just too young to fully understand.
Hey everyone, it's me, Sammy. I'll be talking about my creepy ex-friend. Her name was Becky. She had something odd about her, but I don't know what it was exactly. She used to talk to herself in our school classes and draw really creepy pictures of her favorite character, the Slender Man. One weekend, she invited my friends Adele and Amelia, including me, for a sleepover. I figured since my best friends are going, it won't be so awkward, and agreed. Fast forward to the sleepover, she welcomed us in and led us to the attic. It wasn't the best of places. Mold was all over and a little dusty too. We shrugged it off and tried to have fun. Before we knew it, 11 p.m. rolled around. It wasn't as bad as we thought it might be, until Becky decided to go down the attic's wooden steps. Suddenly, the lights went off. It made us feel a little uneasy, but thought we were being pranked or something. However, out of nowhere, Becky starts crawling up the stairs. It creaked with every step, and Adele asked her to cut it off. Slowly and eerily, she rushed up to me and leaned up on me, looked me dead in the eyes, and tried to put her hands on me. I kicked her off, and we bolted out of the house and told our parents about it. The next day at school, Becky was nowhere to be seen. I guess she was changing schools and decided to pull one last odd prank on us. We'll never know.
When my mother was 16, she used to take babysitting jobs in the town that she lived in Massachusetts. She took a job that was an overnighter to watch 2 young boys. She got to the house around 2 in the afternoon. One of the boys was 5 and the other only 2. The parents said goodbye to their kids. Once the parents left, the children said they wanted to play outside. It was around 4:45 p.m. when they went back inside to watch TV while my mom got dinner ready. Once everything was in the oven, it was around 5:30. She sat down with the boys to watch television until dinner was ready. She noticed something odd. There was a car parked directly across from the house. This wouldn't seem odd to most people, but the house didn't have many neighbors nearby. My mother brushed it off and had the boys come to the table. Once bedtime rolled around, she read them 3 short stories and put them to sleep. When she returned downstairs, she heard a noise that sounded like a doorknob shaking. My mother doesn't freak out easily. She went by the front door to check things out, but nothing was there. She brushed it off, thinking that she was being paranoid. As she sat on the couch and watched TV, she dozed off. But she was awoken a short time later by the sound of someone trying to pick the lock. This is when she became frightened. By the time she got up and checked the door, the noise had stopped. The thought crossed her mind that maybe she was just hearing things. But when she went to go settle back on the couch, she suddenly heard a slamming sound. She looked out the window near the television and saw someone's hand slowly dragging down the window's surface. She screamed, then ran upstairs to wake up the kids and lock herself in the room with them while she called the police. They ran to her scared because they didn't know what was going on. Before she could get her phone out, she heard a slamming from downstairs, as if someone was trying to kick down the front door. She called the cops, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. My mom finished off the night with the kids while police watched the house. After that night, my mom refused to babysit kids overnight ever again. This happened on Halloween of last year. Me and a couple of buddies were out getting candy. Our neighborhood isn't exactly the safest, but it isn't the worst either. About 90 minutes into trick-or-treating, we see a house with a sign that says "Go to the van for your candy," which had an arrow pointing down to a creepy-looking black van. This house was at the end of the street, so if things did go south, it would be easy to get away fast if necessary. We go to the van, and we see a man sitting in the driver's seat. He tells us,
"Your candy is in the back here. Open up the door and come on in."
I know when something is up, and my alarm bells were punching my brain at this point. We all give each other a confused look. Then we ask the man, "Why isn't the door already open? And why aren't you out here? Couldn't you have done the same thing with a take one note or something?" He just repeats himself, telling us to get into the back of his van for our candy. We say no and continue on with our trick-or-treating. About 20 minutes later, we're about 2 blocks away. We notice a van about halfway down the street behind us. The same black van from before. I tell the others and we agree to haul ass back to my friend's house. Once the van notices us running away, it takes off in the other direction. When we got to our friend's house, we frantically tell our parents about what happened. They called the cops, but as far as I know, they never found the van. We agreed not to trick-or-treat this year, and decided to just hang out instead. I still wonder what would have happened if we had been stupid enough to enter that van.
At this point in the internet, nearly everybody who's been on YouTube knows about PewDiePie. I personally found his videos to be okay, which most people constantly brawl about in the comment section. A few days ago, I decided to check out his channel for any new updates and found some. The average surgery simulator, horror games, stuff as usual. I scrolled down until I saw a video I hadn't watched, which is strange because I remember watching most of the surrounding videos. The video's thumbnail didn't surprise me much, it was just black. I thought it was a little strange, but I didn't care much. I didn't get to see the video's title because nearly instantly after clicking it, it went to full screen. It looked like any other PewDiePie video, with his face on the top right of the screen. At first, thinking it was a mistake on Pewdie's part, there was no game, just a black screen and Pewdie's webcam. He narrated it just like any other game, reacting to everything I couldn't see. The video was 10 minutes long, so around 5 minutes in I paused the video and scrolled to the comments to see what was going on. Every comment was basically what you'd see on every other one of his videos, as if he were actually playing the game. I was in the middle of writing a comment, the video unpaused. I, assuming it was me accidentally pressing space, scrolled up to the video to watch. Pewdie was looking straight towards me. PewDiePie is usually looking left and down, since that's how his camera is angled, so it was weird to see that he was suddenly right in front of the webcam. He continued to do nothing for the next 30 seconds, in which he broke the silence by restating his usual intro lines, even though the video was nearly 6 minutes in. When he was about to do his famous screech when he said his name, the video was black until about 7 minutes in. After the video resumed, I could see a terrified looking PewDiePie on the top right. He didn't say anything or do anything. He just looked at whatever he saw, obviously scared beyond belief. This wasn't how PewDiePie normally was when he was afraid. He would usually just screech and laugh it off a few seconds later. I could see that he was genuinely afraid. He started looking around him as if he had just heard something. I could hear a few muffled footsteps in the background of the video, which was probably why PewDiePie looked so paranoid. He got up from his seat and looked around. The video cut off there, but it was only 8 minutes in. After a minute, the video came back on. As far as I could tell, it was being recorded from a poor quality mini camera. PewDiePie was running while holding the camera, so I could basically just see the ground until there was only seconds left in the video. He pointed the camera towards himself, tears in his eyes, and repeated the words, "Forlatnig," until the video finally ended. I don't know what happened, or why no one saw what I saw, but I decided to best not bring things up in the comments. Just before I started writing this, I translated "Forlatnig," which is Swedish for "forgive me."
When my mom was 17, she and my grandparents went for a hike in the Belanglo State Forest in Australia. They had a holiday house in Berrima, which they would visit quite often on weekends, so going on hikes was common. While hiking along the trail that they had been down numerous times before, they came across a couple of abandoned hiking packs, like those massive ones backpackers have. The packs were stuffed full of clothes and food, but no one else was in sight anywhere, and there wasn't any obvious sign as to why they had been left behind. This was in the early 90s, before cell phones were common, so they couldn't contact a ranger to come and have a look at them. My grandmother immediately became concerned by the strangeness of the situation, and she convinced my grandpa that they should immediately go back to the car, which they did. A few nights later, after they returned home to Sydney, my uncle called my grandmother into the living room and pointed at the TV. Some hikers from Germany had been reported missing. They were last seen in the Belanglo forest. My grandmother immediately cried out that her gut feeling had been right, even though technically there was no evidence that those bags they found belonged to those exact hikers. Other news reports that came a few years later in 1994 had the entire family in hysterics. The remains of the bodies have been found in the home of Ivan Milat. Milat had massacred numerous victims in the forest and is now known as the Backpack Killer, and is one of Australia's most notorious serial killers. It is believed that there are still bodies that have yet to be found. The worst part about it was that the 2 hiking packs my family found were never linked to any of the bodies. This means that whoever owned them could still be buried in that forest somewhere. This story is told from the point of view of a female. I'm a college student in my second year at university. Overall, it's pretty nice. Freedom is pretty cool, if you call having a curfew and strict dorm regulations freedom. Anyways, my grades are decent, and there is a few attractive guys in my class. However, currently, I'm sort of stuck, as my entire campus is on lockdown. The text to alert students of the lockdown came around 8 o'clock this morning, and we haven't heard a word since. I room with 2 other girls, a hyper redhead named Allie, and a girl from Africa named Samantha. Both of them are nice enough, and we all get along well. At first, the 3 of us just assumed it was a drill. They have those occasionally. That they just wanted to ensure that everything was okay, and that the emergency alarm system was working properly, and that students know how to respond. However, those tend to stop pretty quickly. It's been hours. Not to mention the yelling we heard at the beginning, though it could have just been the initial panic. It ended up stopping about an hour into the lockdown, though it did scare the daylights out of Samantha. Before anyone questions our safety precautions, we have the blinds down and the doors locked. There's a very small wooden chair shoved under the handle, though I doubt that would do much. Sam and Allie attempted to push the dresser from the bedroom to the door. According to protocol, we're supposed to barricade all possible exits. But the doorway is so small that we can't fit the damn thing in there. Figures that the college board, being a bunch of cheapskates, will cost us our lives. I always joke about it, them being so cheap, but I didn't really think it would actually become a problem in the future. I know I may be overreacting, but are lockdowns really supposed to last this long? Internet and cell service keeps cutting in and out. It's so hard to contact the people in the other dorms. Though Samantha managed to get a hold of her mom briefly, she wasn't aware of the lockdown. She said there wasn't anything on the news. I guess that rules out school shooter, because reporters always end up on site as it's happening. I figured posting this here would at least give me something to focus on. Allie and Sam are talking about checking out around the hallways. Maybe we can find some students who actually know what's going on. My college is a pretty decent size, so it shouldn't be that hard to find someone. I figure if we don't hear anything in the next couple of hours, we should look around. It may have just been a false alarm. Either way, I'll be sure to make an update as soon as I know what's going on. Last night at around 9, Samantha decided that she had enough. Allie and I chickened out, so we stayed here. Sam said that she would be right back. She was going to try to find someone and figure out what's going on, but she hasn't come back. Neither Allie nor I have heard anything. It looks like there are a few posts on social media from other confused students, but all of them are in the same situation we are. There was a brief talk about meeting up, but if Sam didn't come back, I don't know what to think about that. We've also tried to call the police, but they keep hanging up on us. I really don't know what to do. It's been a hectic week. Last time I updated this, Samantha had just left, and it was mostly quiet. After I attempted to call the police, Allie and I spent most of the night studying. Exams are important, and it gave us something to do while we waited. I guess I passed out sometime the night before, because I woke up to the sound of police sirens outside. There was blood. Everywhere. I mean everywhere. On the floor, the walls, and even on the ceiling of the hallways. Over a fourth of our student population is missing. And that isn't counting the bodies that they did manage to find. They were torn apart by something. After the police escorted the remaining students out of their dorms, most of them just went home. My school isn't a very large one, so we all lost at least one person. No one knows where the missing are. The officer said that they try to keep situations like this out of the public eye. God only knows what that means. If your college starts giving an alarm, don't brush it off. Barricade yourself immediately. And if someone knows what happened to Samantha, please tell me.